December 16th, 1944, 0530 hours. A 90-minute German artillery barrage rips through the tree line above a quiet stretch of the Ardennes forest. The opening shot of the largest offensive Germany will launch in the west for the rest of the war. 18 American soldiers and 4 forward artillery observers are dug into foxholes on a wooded hill above a Belgian village most of them have never heard of before this morning. Their job isn't to fight. It's a reconnaissance platoon. Men trained to watch and report and get out before a real fight ever finds them. What's marching toward their position by mid-morning is a battalion of roughly 500 German paratroopers, and the lead element of an entire SS Panzer Corps waiting on the road behind them to punch through toward Antwerp. By any reasonable measure of arithmetic, this fight is already over before it starts. It is not over. And what happens on that hillside over the next several hours is one of the most heavily decorated small unit actions in the history of the U.S. Army, and it's also, from the other side of the fight, a case study in something that doesn't get talked about nearly as often as American acts of heroism do. The moment German officers, staring at a position their own doctrine said should have fallen in minutes, gave up trying to walk through it with rifles and started calling for the guns instead. The platoon belonged to Lieutenant Lyle J. Bach, Jr., the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, 20 years old, and one of the youngest officers in his division, leading men who were, for the most part, replacements with little or no combat experience. Attached to his platoon that morning were 4 forward observers from the 371st Field Artillery Battalion, there to call in fire missions, not to fight from foxholes themselves. Together they numbered 22 men, dug in along a wooded ridge overlooking the village of Lanzerath, holding a gap between 2 American divisions that German planners had specifically identified as a weak point in the line. This is exactly the kind of Bulge story that gets flattened into a single sentence in most documentaries. A small unit delayed the German advance, without ever explaining what that delay actually cost the men trying to force it. If that's the kind of detail you're here for, subscribe so you catch the rest of this series, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. Buch's platoon was actually facing that morning was the 1st Battalion, 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, a paratrooper unit that, on paper, represented some of the more capable infantry Germany still had in the West by this stage of the war, tasked with clearing the road through Lanzerath so that the tanks of the 1st SS Panzer Division, waiting behind them, could push through toward the Meuse. The math should not have been close. Roughly 500 German paratroopers, backed by the promise of an entire armored corps behind them, against 22 Americans with small arms, 2.30 caliber machine guns, a single .50 caliber gun mounted on a jeep, and some mortars, and no armor of their own at all. Bauch's men held their fire as the German column marched into the open field below them, waiting for the entire formation to close the distance so that when the platoon finally opened up, it would hit as many Germans as possible at once. A local Belgian girl's warning to the German officers cost them that element of total surprise, but the ambush still landed hard enough to send the leading paratroopers scrambling for the ditches on either side of the road. What followed was the first of what would become a repeating pattern through the rest of the day, and German platoons forming up and charging directly up the open, snow-covered field toward Buch's hidden positions, bunched together in the open with no attempt at flanking maneuver, walking straight into interlocking fields of fire that had been sighted in on a fence line running across the middle of the field. The first assault broke apart under that fire. So did the second. American accounts from the position describe watching paratroopers try to climb over a 4-foot barbed wire fence bisecting the open ground and being cut down at close range doing it. Men experienced enough to know how dangerous that ground was, and sent forward anyway into a position their own commanders had almost certainly assumed a reconnaissance platoon couldn't actually hold. By early afternoon, after 2 frontal assaults had failed to move 22 Americans off a hillside that should have taken minutes to clear. The German paratroopers changed their approach, not because someone finally thought to flank the position, but because the direct infantry assault that had worked against far tougher defenses earlier in the war simply wasn't working here, and the men making that assault were the ones paying for it. The third assault, launched around 2:00 in the afternoon, it looked different from the first 2 the moment it started. This time the German paratroopers came forward with heavy machine gun and mortar fire, walking in ahead of the infantry, an acknowledgement from whoever was directing the attack by this point that simply sending men across open ground into rifle fire wasn't accomplishing anything except adding to the casualty count, piling up in the field below Bach's position. It was the kind of tactical adjustment German infantry doctrine had built its reputation on throughout the war. Suppress first, then advance, and it should have been the assault that finally broke the platoon. It nearly did. Sergeant Bill Slape took over the platoon's .50 caliber machine gun during this attack and fired it so continuously, so far past what the weapon was designed to sustain, yet the barrel overheated and the gun seized up entirely in his hands. A detail that says as much about how close this assault came to succeeding as any casualty count does. In the middle of the fighting, forward observer Billy Queen was shot in the stomach. There was no medic with the platoon and no surgical equipment anywhere nearby. Queen died from the wound before the day was over, the platoon's only fatality in a fight where German losses were already climbing well into the dozens. The fighting produced one detail that has been repeated in nearly every account of the battle since, because it captures something about how close and how desperate this actually was at ground level. As German mortar fire started landing with increasing accuracy on the American position, Private First Class Risto Milsovek noticed a German soldier working over a man on the ground who appeared to already be dead, dressed as a medic. Watching him more closely, and Milsovek spotted a pistol on the man's belt, something a legitimate medic wouldn't be in that role, and concluded the man was actually a forward observer disguised to move safely across the field and adjust German fire directly onto the American foxholes. And Milsovek shot him. Whether or not that specific read of the situation was correct, the accuracy of the German mortar fire dropped noticeably afterward. By mid-afternoon, and Lieutenant Buch's radio operator was still relaying updates back to regimental headquarters, reporting the platoon was continuing to take artillery and mortar fire, but was holding its position against an estimated German force that headquarters, reasonably enough, had no way to independently verify. Buch himself had called back earlier in the day asking for American artillery support against the German column while it was still marching into the open, support that never came because German attacks elsewhere across the 99th Division sector had every available battery already committed. The platoon that spent the day forcing the German attackers from rifles to machine guns to mortars was, for most of that same day, fighting entirely without any indirect fire support of its own. The position finally broke at dusk, not because the Germans found a way through the front of it, but because they went around it. And German infantry worked their way to the flank of Buch's line in the fading light and closed in from an angle the platoon's carefully sighted fields of fire had never been built to cover. What followed was close, chaotic fighting at short range as the German assault finally reached the American foxholes directly. Buch himself was wounded in the fighting. With ammunition running low, the position overrun, and no realistic path to withdrawal left, a platoon's survivors were taken prisoner as the sun went down. By any conventional measure, the battle ended in an American defeat. 21 of the 22 men on that hillside were captured, 14 of them while already wounded. But measured against what both sides had actually needed from that day, the outcome reads very differently. A single reconnaissance platoon, never intended to fight a pitched battle at all, had held a battalion of roughly 500 German paratroopers, the lead element of an entire SS Panzer Corps, in place for nearly the full day, inflicting German casualties that some post-war accounts place as high as 92 men killed, wounded, or missing, against 1 American killed. And every hour that battalion spent trying to clear that hillside was an hour the armor waiting behind it. The spearhead of Kampfgruppe Piper could not move forward, SS Standartenführer Joachim Piper, commanding the armored spearhead waiting behind the paratroopers all day, finally reached Lanzerath around midnight. Roughly 12 hours behind the schedule, his own offensive had been built around. He was, by every account of that night, furious. His tanks had been sitting on a road going nowhere for most of a day, blocked not by an American division or even a full battalion, but by 22 men who weren't even supposed to be a combat unit in the first place. And Paper finally pushed his column through the woods, beyond Lanzerath in the dark. He discovered there had never been the larger American force his own officers had assumed was hiding there. Just the same reconnaissance platoon that had spent the day making a battalion of paratroopers pay for every yard of an open field. And that 12-hour delay didn't happen in isolation. It stacked on top of similar friction across the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive that same day. American units elsewhere along the line, often outnumbered just as badly, and buying their own hours the same way. Military historians studying the opening days of the Bulge have consistently pointed to this compounding effect as one of the reasons the German timetable for reaching the Meuse River collapsed as badly as it did. And Kampfgruppe Peiper would go on to advance further than almost any other German column in the offensive, but it never came close to keeping the schedule the entire plan depended on. And the first crack in that schedule opened on a hillside above Lanzerath against a unit whose actual job that morning had been to watch and report, not to fight a battalion to a standstill. For the men of Bock's platoon, none of that strategic significance meant much in the moment. And 21 of the 22 were taken prisoner as the sun went down on December 16th, wounded men included, and spent the rest of the war in German captivity. Lieutenant Buch himself was wounded and captured, and would spend months as a prisoner of war before the fighting in Europe finally ended. What they had actually accomplished that day, inflicting close to 100 German casualties, destroying the schedule of an entire SS Panzer Corps' lead element, and doing it with a unit 25 times smaller than the force attacking them, went almost entirely unrecognized in the immediate aftermath. In the chaos of the opening days of the Bulge, meant there was no clear paper trail connecting a single reconnaissance platoon's radio reports to what had actually happened on that ridge, and the men who could have explained it in detail were sitting in German POW camps, while the paperwork that should have documented their actions simply never got filed. It took decades, and one man's persistence, to change that. After the war, Lyle Bock spent years trying to get proper recognition for what his platoon had done at Lanzerath, and running into a military bureaucracy that had no clean record of an action fought by men who were captured before anyone in their own chain of command could fully document it. It wasn't until 1981, 37 years after the battle, that the U.S. Army formally recognized the platoon's actions with a wave of decorations, including the Distinguished Service Cross for Buck himself. By the time the paperwork was finally settled, a platoon that fought at Lanzerath Ridge had become one of the most highly decorated small units in the history of the U.S. Army for a single day's engagement. A recognition that arrived so late that some of the men it honored had already died waiting for it. If the story of Lanzerath Ridge actually demonstrates, when you follow it from the first frontal assault through the escalation to mortars and machine guns to the eventual flanking maneuver at dusk, isn't really about artillery at all. It's about what happened when a German unit that had trained and fought its way across multiple fronts of the war ran into a defensive position it simply couldn't solve with the tools it had planned to use. And rifles and a straightforward charge should have cleared that hillside in minutes. When that failed twice, and the paratroopers didn't have the luxury of simply walking away, the entire offensive behind them depended on this road being open. So they escalated to the heaviest supporting fire they had access to in the field, and even that only bought them a few more hours, not a quick victory. 22 men, most of them never trained or equipped to fight a battle like this one, held that ground long enough to matter to the outcome of the largest German offensive of the war in the West. And it took the U.S. Army 37 years to fully account for what that actually cost and what it was actually worth.